what I would like to do for you is to perhaps bring you into a different side of exploring the world of books and exploring the world of authors, because I come to this museum primarily as an artist, and because even at the beginning, even though this project was my first serious early work as a photographer, I knew instinctively, it was incredible, I had to trust my instincts, that somehow, some way, that this work was going to be important. And in the life of every photographer, there are works that will emerge later on when you look back that have some more significance than others, or play a more important part, a more important role in your life. So for me, having had the opportunity to have this book published once and then published again, and to constantly revisit this amazing experience that I had. It's a narrative that I'm telling you a story tonight, that when I look at it, I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity not only to be down there, but to somehow, some way, after years of fighting with them, to get a little glimmer into this world that not only do I kind of miss, but these men taught me the most valuable lesson in survival, because that's what this story is really about. And through the rest of my life so far, every day I hear some quote from one of these people that you're going to see, and it's there, like shepherding through this myriad of what I consider to be the most complicated times that we're living in, and certainly the most stressful. So one thing I have to tell you about me is that I'm from Brooklyn, and I tend to talk a lot and go off on different trajectories, and I'm also very bad with everything. So Josh, I'm going to need you. So I advance it like this, right? All right.
Point at the computer.
So, what happened to the Giuliani political cartoon?
It's on the next. It's in there if you want.
It's in there?
Yep.
Oh. All right. So, okay. So the other thing is on these walls, because I am an artist, you're going to see different kinds of representations of the same pictures. So you'll see if there's two framed photographs. One's kind of on the hallway, and the others are all digitally produced. So one of the things I want you to take note of, that back in the days, we used to make pictures by hand. And you used to actually take the film, go in your darkroom. You didn't even know what you shot. You were just looking through the viewfinder. And then you would process your film, you'd get better and better at it, and then you would make the prints. So now, these early works are considered vintage, and I'm not selling them. My mentor, one of my mentors, Bruce Davidson, said, don't sell your vintage prints. Wait. So we have here two, and then the one in the case is from the 90s, when we had this quote-unquote mysterious fire down on South Street. Now, at the end of my little talk, and I'll probably go off, you're welcome to ask me questions, or you can comment, but there are certain things that even now, a million years later, so let's place South Street. I love this photograph because you actually, this is the pointer, right? I don't like these red things, but at any rate, you can see all the buildings rising, like there they are, and here we have the most precious part of Lower Manhattan, and I assume that you all know this, that America began right there. That was our port. That's where the Dutch came. They settled on this side of the East River. they named the streets, then they settled in Brooklyn, named the same streets, named streets the same names as they had on the Manhattan side. Trading began, all the what do you call it? The beaver skins and, you know, all kinds of precious resources that the island had to offer were being shipped back to Holland, to the Dutch, making them richer. So that part of New York City history always fascinated me. And the fact that living where I have for so long and knowing everything about the streets, why the streets flood, what happened here, what happened there, was all part of understanding the other interesting thing, that this part of the waterfront is built on landfill, but not garbage in the traditional sense that we have refuse now. It was oyster shells, and since all the Dutch did farming, it was all the discard, the debris from a day of farming, or dead, if a cow died, you know, he'd get thrown into the river. So for years, that kind of dribbled into the sediment. So you have a waterfront that is so interesting because, yes, it is built on landfill, but it's actually built on animal parts and marine, you know, calcified seashells, and that is a, you know, to me, I always thought that was one of the most interesting things. And of course, the oysters were first eaten by the Lenape Indians that were there before the Dutch. So they were the ones that harvested all the oysters, and then they would eat them and just throw them into the river. It's still hard for me to wrap my head around it, you know, how that actually occurred. But those are important facts if you're a New Yorker. You want to know that when you walk the waterfront here, you're walking on oyster shells and, you know, and cow dung and whatever else has went down to the bottom of the river. All right, so that is, you know, we're placing South Street in the context of Lower Manhattan. Okay, so we've all had a good look at this political cartoon. And again, this is something I put in because tonight I'm doing a little bit of a process talk because I'm interested now in moving on and publishing the third edition of South Street. So this is a little bit of the archives, you know, piles of negatives. I photographed on South Street for 5 years. It took me 5 years to actually be there, find the photographs, know when I felt I had my story, that there were no more stories to tell at that point. So this gives you a little idea of what a photographer from the film world actually went through. Piles and piles of negatives.
What year was this?
This was, you mean
Well,
that I
you said
photographed
this?
this?
Yeah,
I
you
just
wrote
photographed it a couple
70?
months ago.
70?
No, this is we're talking about the 80s now. So I have
No, I
photographed.
mean originally, when we started the photos.
When did I start? In 1980. Okay. So this is the first photograph we're looking at. I recently found in my archives, and I don't know if any of you know how much this block has transformed over the last 50 years. So when I moved down to my loft, we had what was called a garage building. However, what they did with the garage building was they put a beautiful, you can see the stone plaque, Fulton Market, with a beautiful carved fish. And here you had some of the businesses that existed for years and years there, and we'll look at photographs. The market, one thing I want to say as we look at this is that you have to understand that this confined space, literally of 3 or 4 blocks, there was the most drama, the most exciting time to be there was at night. So these stalls and storefronts would come alive with all of this activity. But when I first moved in, needless to say, I didn't know, I was just getting used to the area. And at that time, as a younger photographer, I was very influenced by work of Berenice Abbott, who had done Changing New York, and Walker Evans. So I would walk around and just look at this rustic beauty. And one of the things about living on the waterfront was what attracted so many painters of the generation before me was the light, because for years there was no high-rises. It was just this wonderful light that would just come. And you could see from this photograph, right now, this is where that, the thing is. The Rouse Mall, and then it was Howard Hughes, it was General Growth. And so when I moved in, they were just now clearing the way for another building. But this one, where you had all the businesses, they weren't going to leave alone. This was already targeted for major construction, and they could not move the businesses from there. Smitty's Filet, ABC Filet, Crown wouldn't go, and there was no place for them to go. So I felt instinctively there was some drama that was happening. So as I continued to peruse the neighborhood, these were some of my earliest photographs that I took, because I couldn't believe it. I'd step outside my door, and I was very mindful of my early photography, and I used, for all of you photographers in there, I was shooting with film that they don't make anymore. I was very competitive with other male photographers, so I wanted my pictures to, they would use big view cameras, so I wanted my pictures to look as big and beautiful as theirs. So I used to go in my darkroom and experiment around. So these photographs that we're looking at now were my first impressions of the waterfront. And I'm re-experiencing this now because these photographs I totally forgot that I had taken. So, and by the way, as I continued on through my journey on South Street, these are headless swordfish, okay? And they're called pups. You had to learn the jargon. These are the pups. So I titled this photograph, Pups in Peck Slip. So that's where we are now. We're in Peck Slip, and I'm showing you now the boundaries of the market. And what I loved about this is the Brooklyn Bridge was always very pervasive. It was not only pervasive for me, but for the workers. That was their, it was almost like a mantra every night where they would come and, especially the journeymen, as they would go up and down South Street, the Brooklyn Bridge and the moon would become like a soulful experience as they worked to have the symbol of the bridge was part of the mainstay of their psychology. I don't know if I'm explaining it too well, but we'll get onto it. The other thing that I wanted you to see in this photograph, and maybe Carol can answer this because I can't. This is part of a window, a storefront in Peck Slip. So this photograph, you can't see it too well, but there are these plaques. So some historical society would put these little plaques around the neighborhood, and it was, to me, it was funny because, so this one pointed to the fact that there was a wharf here at one time in the 1700s. So there you would have, I would stand there, and look at what was going on, and then to try and imagine that that was a place where ships, it was a slip where boats and ships were stationed before they went out into the East River. So these are the little gems that my first impressions. Now, this was also an early photograph, but I put this in the talk tonight because I want you to understand that South Street was sort of like the heart of the Fulton Fish Market. Everything happened on that street. Not only were trucks and vans coming into the market at certain hours of the day, and then there would be traffic at certain hours of the day, but it was a very good photograph, so we can look inside the old market building at the same time and see the busyness of the street and see what incredible hubbub was going on in there. So let me give you a couple of facts about the Fulton Market. We used to call it the market. I never called it the Fulton Fish Market. That it was the largest seafood hub in the Western Hemisphere. Think about that. This was one of our largest food markets, not only in New York City, but in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, I could never get a straight answer, but we know that the Fulton Market generated millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of business every year. So these photographs, or this kind of probing, was done initially as a almost like a reaction to what I would see, this incredible amount of activity. And money changing hands, and people rushing around, and trucks, you know, and this guy, Benny's Express, he was there every day at a certain time, and you get to know some of the trucks, who was driving the trucks. So what looks like complete chaos and confusion really wasn't. It was a sort of a cycle of events that would happen every day. So. And this photograph, which I just found, I love this, because again, this is an early photograph, and you could see, you know, we're talking about South Street, that this is more of a close-up of what was going on there. You have a journeyman coming this way from one of the fish businesses in the new market building on the East River, which is this one right here, okay? And then you would have him. He was great. There would be certain people out in the street directing traffic, and then you'd have, you know, the buyers and the sellers, you know, going back and forth across the street. And he was a loader, so he was helping him. I mean, it was just complete insanity. Like every second of the day, every second of their business day, there was something going on. But South Street was really noted for complete chaos. But I also want you to notice how these guys dressed, because they were outside, you know, all night, and they all wore these signature boots, which, and Josh, I need you to keep track of the time. So this photograph was part of a shoot I did for the Smithsonian, and I climbed up on the FDR Drive. And this also gives you a nice overview of the amount of activity and business that was going on every single day. And of course it looks like chaos, but I'm going to break it down for you. And then here's one in color, good old Kodachrome. So, and you can see on this side of the street, all notice how mostly all the fish that was coming into the market was packed in wooden crates. There was no styrofoam, no nothing. It was all, and the big ones, like the halibut boxes, really looked like coffins. And if you read the book, you know, I thank God I did, like, I knew instinctively that the vernacular of the street was going to be just as important as the photographs. So I was desperate to record many of the stories, and that part of it took years to let, you know, for them to feel comfortable talking to me, even about the simplest things, including their childhoods. So we see here, I'm trying to give you an overview of what a busy place this was, you know. And now, we're looking at this because back in the 80s, this itself was Skywarn Rd. Now, of course, it's very different, but it was still being used by the fish businesses, and you could start to see here that all of these new renovations are starting to happen. And this part of Skywarn Rd was used as a loading zone for all the retailers who came to the market to buy fish, and the journeymen would bring their bought inventory to their vans, and they would drive away after everything came in. And now this one, I chose for this talk tonight because he's standing in Skywarn Rd, which now Howard Hughes has, there's probably like a food stand or whatever there is out there now. So for me, the idea that in my lifetime I can see these small square blocks being transformed from this kind of activity with these kinds of people to something so completely beyond, so completely different is astonishing. The other thing that I'm going to talk about now is some of the people, some of the men that worked at the market. They were all different kinds, but lots of times, certain jobs, there was like a scale. And one of the things about the market is that there was work for everyone. There was no prerequisite to get a job there. If you were uneducated, if you had just come out of prison, there would be a place for you. You could find something, even if it was the lowest menial task on the ladder. So this gentleman here, a lot of these, or some of these people who had these jobs were people who had just gotten out of prison. And what the market did was give them a sense of, your job is your worth. And that kept coming back to me the whole time. So part of this introductory phase, Josh, you have to keep track of the time, was the first photographs I ever took, and I had to come back during the day because they wouldn't let me in at night. And so this was really my first friend, Mikey the bartender, and he was right out of like a Humphrey Bogart movie. I mean, I used to love the way he held his cigarette. And the thing about the Paris bar was that it always had this, it was always like meticulously clean, so you could see these reflections. So this is what the bar looked like right before it closed. So I was very happy that they actually let me in. And so let me tell you a little bit about these two guys. So this was Ed Moran, who was our very famous ship captain, who at one time had a very illustrious career as a captain. And I don't know, when I came down to South Street, he had already started drinking. There is someone in the audience that will be able to tell us more about Ed Moran as I continue on. So he used to spend all his days when I came aboard. There were so many bars in the neighborhood and haunts. So he, along with some of the other old timers, would just go from place to place to drink. And the clock is on the other side of the wall, but I took these pictures at 8:30 in the morning. So, and that's Larry Lombardi, and he would look at him, and he at one time was a watchman, and we'll get into talking about organized crime and that a little later. But Larry, like so many of the other people that worked there, other men, was part of a long legendary history of coming to this country and settling under the Brooklyn Bridge in what we call the Fourth Ward. Now, I put this one in, I just found this one, because this is what a photographer is up against when you first try to start coming into a closed society or people who don't want you there. And you have to remember that when I first started photographing, the first wave of investigations to happen on my watch was happening at the same time. So nobody wanted me around. Nobody. No matter how nice people were or whatever, they just didn't. So this kind of represents a little bit of that scared quality, you know, well, I can't get any closer. And at this time, since I was learning about the neighborhood, I was starting to read in the papers that the first mall was going to be built. So we still had fishing boats coming to port, and this was totally amazing. So I was so lucky. I had to get out on the pier and photograph the last fishing trawler to come in. There was actually a scallop boat from North Carolina. So at that time, I knew I knew no one in the market except this one guy who worked outside of Cornelius. I would bother him, and he says, well, okay, I'll let you stand there for a couple of minutes. So you have to remember that everything had to happen really fast, and I wasn't working with digital equipment. This was all, I had a Rolly, which was a twin lens camera. They took film and you had to crank it. You know, they didn't even know what I was up to. However, I got this photograph only because I told them I would I'd do a striptease for them. So they came together except for this guy. And I made my photograph, which is now the last fishing boat, you know. So, and then this one I just found in my archives. I love it because you see him emptying the ice after they had unloaded the scallops, and you could really see the lines of the hemp rope of the boat, and I love the fact that you can see his face in there. And since composition is a very important part of my life as a photographer, you know, I'm looking for clues now for photographs that, you know, can go into the next group of pictures. So, when I first started trying to explore South Street, the real action happened at night. So this is what, I have to remember that everywhere I went with my camera, they would kick me out. It was not, you know, so this one, I remember I mounted it on a tripod because it was at night, it was really hard to get the shots. So then after I got this one, and I love it because you see the buildings going up in the background, so it gives you a real sense of, you know, the proportions of things. So in my early experiences, I had to look for friends. I had to look for friends because that's how you maneuvered your way into this man's world that was very, very closed. They had no time for anyone. They only had a window to make money, and that was it, you know. So they didn't want cameras around when the investigations were going on, and everyone was paranoid. So this is Kiva Watcher, and he used to stand, and he was very mysterious to me, but I lived around the corner, so every night when I started coming down to bother everyone, he would be right there. And he'd you know, once we kind of made friends, he'd call me Barbara Darling. And the only other person that ever called me Barbara Darling was my mother. So, but what his job was really, and right now there was that hotel, the Seaport Hotel. This is now Peck Slip and Front Street. So you wouldn't recognize it. So what he would do, he was a loan shark. And his job, and then he was also the cook up at the first he was at the Paris bar, and then he was at the club. So his job every night was to give out vigs to people who needed money to buy seafood or to, you know, whatever they needed the money for, he was there. And it took a long time for me to know that. And it wasn't until years later, way after I had done this project, that I found out that he was a real wise guy. And I didn't understand why, there were things that I could not understand, but all I know is that I needed to place him in this environment. He was so important, and you could see just from his outfit that he wasn't a working man in that capacity. But I love it. There was an old Circle Fish sign. And so we're now, I'm showing you a little of the work activity. I asked Josh before how would he like to work down there. And I used to follow around this shrimp roll cart because there was still someone there who actually sold some packaged goods to some of the owners so that they could resell them to their customers. So you would see these carts, there were two around the market. And then, on the other hand, there were the journeymen, or people who did several jobs. And one of the things that I always admired about these guys was that no matter where they came from or their back histories, they did this back-breaking work. And this is what they did every single night. And, so going through my files, I saw this one, and I kind of just loved it, because you just see, in my view, in the hurriedness, the way everything is stacked, that he did not have the time. His boss said, get that to truck number 31 in Dougherty loading zone, the tags went on there, and he had to go. So over time, the longer I was there fighting with them, at a very sensitive time in their history, the more they started to see that I was not going to hurt them, And again, you could see how I'd love to follow the shrimp roll cart. And you can see this is Peck Slip. Because back then we used to have snows and floods, and every other day there was some horrible weather that these men had to endure. Every night, every single day. And so I had to, and it's okay, I can talk about this. I had to find one stand that would allow me protection. And what I mean by protection in this context was a place where I could keep my cameras, where I could actually do work, where I could make my notes, where if I had an interview with someone and they would never talk into a tape recorder, where I could just put my things and know they wouldn't get stolen or broken or, and the stand that I actually, this was South Street back then, filled with all these, this is the side of the street that's closer to Peck Slip. So I became, is that the right word, ingratiated. I tried so hard to bring down all my photography books. I had to show the boss what I was up to, who I was. So it took a year and a half maybe to let them finally put my equipment down. And this crew, this particular business, yielded a lot of power in the market. So these guys all have histories of coming from very poor families. They were all Sicilian, of Sicilian descent. And particularly this young man whose father was murdered by another individual in one of the crime families, and his only means of, he was in and out of jail, and then his uncle got a stand down at the market, and so they still felt they had a need to do this extra work, or to feel that they could continue to practice a certain kind of lifestyle, and that is having the guns was protection for them. They also sometimes were they were actual hitmen who went out on like him. And by the way, a lot of these people that you see, the personalities here and the kinds of backgrounds that they came from were so varied and so diverse. And one of the things that is such a miscalculation by so many people about the fish market, that it wasn't like every business there that has had a longevity. There was always a tradition of having mafia influence. You think of in New York, we have many books and movies about that, but it was a layer of the market. It wasn't the whole story by any means. However, if I needed protection, these were the guys that were gonna keep my cameras safe. And that's all I cared about. So this is definitely, that was Big John. And he was in and out of jail so much, and you would call it going away. And when someone came back, they'd say, "Oh, you were away? Oh, you're back? Oh, yeah, that's really good. You know, you know." So you would go away. You were never going to prison. You were going away. Now, this is where the story started to get interesting, because around the time that I was down there, this is when the story continued with this tiny enclave of the waterfront, where the next round of tearing down and development was going to happen. And just remember, on the same place, all these years, the same insanity's been going on. It's just been destruction and construction, destruction and construction. And in the middle are the arguments, the conflicts, and the horrendous battles over New York City real estate. So I came in right in the beginning of this, and this drama, for me, I was desperate to capture that. And again, you know, the men that worked at the market, they couldn't figure me out because I was really obsessed. But at the same time, I knew the clock was ticking. So sometimes I would have to sign waivers, do whatever I could to convince them that I could go climbing to get these photographs. So this one I particularly love, because you see the journeyman coming from the ice house, which I'll show you in the next photograph, and they all were watching the impending wrecking balls. You know, this symbolic, this absolute symbolism of the working man against his destruction. And this one I just recently found, and this, we're moving back to the other side of the street, where you start to see that the market, the owners of the businesses in the market were constantly fighting with the corporations for their space. So I was just so thankful that I just used to take pictures of every little thing that happened. It was a major event. And, you know, there I was. So you can see in this photograph, you know, that they're up there trying to put the level on, and, you know, Frank is probably in Smitty's having a heart attack, you know. But the point is that the two worlds would have to operate at the same time in the same space. And that was, there was going to be a winner, and then there was going to be a loser. So in this photograph, you can see it's a little bit further along in there, and you start to see this thing being built over their heads, you know. So, and again, the street just would never stop. It was like the city that never slept. It was, and these I found because all around the neighborhood at this point was destruction. I mean, everything was getting ripped up. And again, as a younger photographer, you just have to photograph this stuff. It was like, you know, for me, it was, you know, passionate. You know, you know, and the fact that I lived in this area, that this was my home, made it even more significant.
part. We got like 5 more minutes.
Oh, are you kidding me? Oh, no. All right. Well, here are some of the interiors, because, you know, I picked a few of these out so you could just get a little glimpse of what life was like, you know, in these little offices. And so as I continued my exploration of the interiors of the market, we found one of the seminal photographs. And this is very important to talk about because these men were really smart and they were like soothsayers. Does everyone know what is like the medieval soothsayer? You know, where you're predicting the future? Well, there you go. You know, it was right there, written on the wall. The corporation was coming. And there's no more seminal photograph in this photo essay than this. And these are the stolen bricks from Peck Slip that the corporation took to re-cobblestone Dougherty loading zone. So, you know. Then I found this one, because this one is so instrumental, because during the investigations, I mean, I'm going to have to stop soon, they felt the press was maligning them. They hated the press. So I found this on one of the walls in the locker room. This part of the talk is very important because before the owners of the companies would come and the customers would come, we would have this amazing time of night when I finally got permission to photograph when the unloaders showed up. And that was so interesting because there was hardly a soul around. It was just a few select workers, crews, unloading all this fish which was now coming in by truck. So you can see, this is Peck Slip, and this is the old tin building. And notice how clean it is. Every night, every day before they left their places of business, everything was put away. The places became, you know, they were never really greatly organized, but clean and organized for the next day, which was their night. That's, no one would have it any other way. So these are the some of the unloading photographs. And you could start to see the trucks coming in, and it was, everything happened under the viaduct. So this is the place where a lot of the stealing went on. But you had to be in these certain crews to do the stealing, which is, you have to read the book. But some of these men I was able to photograph, and I put Nunzio. Nunzio is, the reason I'm showing you him is that this is the symbol, one of the symbols of the Fulton Market for me, because he came from Sicily, settled on Cherry Street, grew up in a flat, you know, that had 2 rooms, and he and his brother both sought work at the Fulton Market because that's what they knew. They lived in the area, they were fishermen, their fathers were fishermen back in Sicily. Their whole life was about water and the sea. So he, the night I asked him for a photograph after being there for like 3 years. He had just been released from jail for tax evasion. Well, you know, he was angry and bitter, and all of these unloaders, all of these men had, this was their pride. They were, you know, they had a task, they had a job, and they were going to do it. And my job was in 3 minutes or less, was to nail that photograph and tell that story. And, you know, so, and this is a little bit what would go on, you know, a little bit after the trucks were unloaded. You start to see the insanity in between the trucks. You know, everyone was busy moving fish, doing this and doing that. So this is a detail of another photograph. And everybody had a job, you know, and you could almost see on their faces how anxious they were because they knew that their lives were being scrutinized. The story I want wanted to tell is all these strange retailer trucks that would show up at the market and all the characters that would gravitate down there. And some of the more beautiful lyrical images of boots and work hands, arthritic work hands, or the bottom feeders that would come to the dock after all the fish was sold and scoop up what remained so they could clean it off, you know, scrape it off and sell it in Chinatown for 25 cents. That was his job, and that's what he did every day. And you can see here the old high, what are they called? They're pier things, yeah. And, you know, then at 7 o'clock, the whole drama changed again, because then we had everybody walking to work. And the consciousness, the awareness between the blue collar and the white collar was never as strong as it was down on South Street. And for me, you know, to observe that, by this time, I was on the inside looking out. So I can look at these corporate people almost out of their eyes. And we're back at the Ice House because I wanted you to see a little bit of, that's this vintage photograph, a little bit of the routines and these Rube Goldberg contraptions that they had available to them. These are some of the filleters who had very noble work. They filleted fish all night long, and every fillet was hand cut. Some of my fillet portraits. And I love this. This is an order form from one of the wholesalers. This is before they used computers. Nobody used computers. They would stand outside or they would write everything down. And this is a coffee stain on the side of the page. And this is another photograph I recently found. You know, you could really see a lot of the drama in there. The busy, you know, the cartons of fish are going in, they're going out. This guy's talking to that guy. And very intense relationships. So this is between a customer and an owner, a wholesaler. And you can see how everybody talked with their hands. And this is old Mortimer, and they still let him work there. He was 88. Notice the classic boots, because everything was always wet. You know, the whole environment was filled with ice and hosing down water. And here's another view of South Street. You could see how busy it is at night. And then we move into the 90s where the battle for space intensified, and then we had a mysterious fire that ravaged the fish market, and the place started to deteriorate. Businesses started losing customers. The whole demise was on its way. So this is Beekman and South Street. And these photographs I just found, these were the last days before they left for good. So this is inside one of the fish companies. And this photograph, which I think is the last one in this presentation, is the day that the last day at the market. And this particular business, one of the longest, oldest businesses in the market, the owner committed suicide. And it was like, did anybody here see Zorba the Greek? You know, that amazing scene when the widow dies and, you know, the women come in and start stripping the place and carrying things away. That's what happened there. It was like insane. It was like this vibrant, viable heartbeat of the New York economy was reduced to this. That's my interpretation. I mean, and you know, so I think that's it with my. Of the work of the negatives, that's all. Yes, now we're ready for questions.
Have you been up to Hunts Point?
No.
No.
No, there's nothing for me there. I mean, a lot of the men that I knew, I've tried to keep in touch with a few, but no, it's why I don't, a lot of the people that I loved and respected, or they're gone. They've all passed, and I don't. Even the ones that I still know that are remaining, which are so few, it's too strange to go. Maybe I will, but no. But up until now, no. Yes. Next question.
So I have two questions.
Okay.
One, since you lived in the area, did you basically live the hours that they worked?
Yes. Yes.
When you start in the daytime?
Yes, it was brutal because I am not someone that likes to be up. I like my sleep. No, and of course what I'm leaving out of this talk, because now it comes back to me, but I remember when there were several murders down there, and I would get these phone calls from my friends in the middle of the night. Barbara, you want to sleep in tonight? Just stay home, okay? Click. That would be it. You know, and all I wanted to do was just do these pictures. You know, as an artist, I just wanted this, you know. But this was an incredible experience that I had. One that, and yes, I had to change my work hours, and it was brutal. And I remember when I was down there, I think it's in this book, but sometimes the sleep deprivation was so bad and so acute that some people lost their lives while driving. They would just fall asleep on the expressway, because a lot of these younger ones lived in New Jersey by that time. So, yeah.
And second question, as you see this photo here, it seems to me they moved. Did they not move to other area, the market itself?
They moved to Hunts Point.
Right.
Bloomberg gave them a refrigerator.
So that
in the Bronx.
transition took place as they closed, they went over there, is that right?
Yeah, but not all of them. A lot of the small businesses could not make that change. They did not have the equity. It was only the larger businesses that had really, really major clients and could turn over a lot of seafood every week. So no, the market kept shrinking. This was the end. I mean, the whole experience of the 80s to the 90s was, and I am grateful for the fact that I got to know the real soul of the market, these old-timers who were the toughest, most amazing men, that came from nothing and had a certain pride, whether they lived outside the law or not. And even Bob Dylan said, if you live outside the law, you must be honest. And that's the thing that I loved about being in the market, is that there was no BS. And as a professional in the world that I inhabit, that's it. And I'm sure the world you inhabit, that we put up with too much of that, Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yes.
You said you were going to talk about Ed Moran.
Yes, well, we have someone here. Charlie, are you here? Is Charlie here? Charlie, can you tell this lady about Ed Moran? We have someone who's a legend of his own, one of my original amazing friends from the Seaport. I'll see if I can. We never called it the Seaport, by the way. Not Seaport. It was like South Street. But I don't know. I'll find it, but just tell her about Ed.
Edmund Francis Moran. He was an officer in the Merchant Marine. He served in the Second World War. He came from East Boston. His father was a surgeon. His father was a surgeon, and Ed would have an obsession with having his hands very clean. So he was very fastidious when it came to his hands. And he was so fastidious, there was a bar called the Square of the Bar downtown. The Square of the Bar, right. which was probably buried in one of the pictures of rubble that you saw. But the owner of the bar was Nick Olatka, and he and Ed had sort of a antagonistic relationship. But if Ed washed his hands and came to the bar, he would not touch the doorknob to open the door to get into the bar. The bar door had a small window, and Ed would kind of leer into it and smile and laugh and wait, and someone would get up and try to let Ed in, and Nick would yell at him and say, "Don't let that SOB into the bar." So someone would eventually leave the bar, and Ed would sneak in and sit at a table with his hands like this, and he would say, Nick, send the beer." And Nick, of course, would not send the beer, and he'd glare at Ed, and he would put a beer on the counter and say, "On your feet, sailor, and get your own beer." And Ed would kind of begrudgingly go over it. But, you know, they had that kind of relationship. Ed Moran, I used to work with this guy, Joe Ropes, who was down at South Street, Joe Shearer, yeah. And Ed and I and Joe and this other guy, Steve, did a lot of rigging work in the harbor. We actually did some rigging work for Broadway shows back in the 70s and 80s, Barnum, I guess, Three Musketeers, and Joe Ropes used to say, "I wish I knew what Ed forgot about rope, because he was that good." He was a real artist, and I don't mean just with fancy work, I mean with practical use of rope and tackles, and it was exasperating to work with Ed because he was such a traditionalist. He would never use a piece of tape to wrap the end of the line up. He would always whip it and put a little line around it. Everything had to be perfect with Ed. Ed used to live on Lightship Ambrose, and as the area sort of developed and the museum became more sophisticated, Ed had to leave, and we managed to secure a place for him down at Sailor Snug Harbor down in North Carolina. And just let me finish it. So one of us took him down there, and everything was set and settled. And about a month later, I'm walking down the street, and there's Ed Moran on the street. He escaped. He had enough bus fare money that he came back to New York with a bus, and then another one of us had to take him back down. It was a very
Any other
powerful
questions we can ask Barbara?
I mean,
wine and some snacks.
The thing about this area is that it's a treasure. It's a national treasure, the market, and what we shared tonight was just the tip of the iceberg. It was for me one of the most complex challenges to put this story together and to keep finding these photographs. I hope you all enjoyed tonight, and thank you for coming. And I also want to thank Carol. Thank you, Carol, for the opportunity to do this. And Josh, you, as we say, you.
We have books for sale in the bookstore too, so Barbara will sign books.
Super. So that means you're fans of Barbara Mensch, right?
Yes.
Or soon to be. Soon to be. Holds the book up while so I'll have to introduce myself, and I'm Carol Willis, and I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum. So people who are new, welcome. There's some people around the corner back there. We do book talks once a month, every month, in order to cover a wide range of topics from skyscrapers and New York City history and cities around the world, so past, present, and future of the skyscraper, but also subjects especially of New York City history and of urbanism in general. And if you were here, some of you were here maybe last month when Mike Wallace talked about his new tome, 1,200 pages, Greater Gotham. In addition to have this special experience of you being here tonight, you can also relive it on our website, and you can go listen to Mike Wallace on our website, so skyscraper.org, for those of you who didn't find us that way. And when you're there and after the talk, I hope you'll look around this exhibition, which is called, if you came directly, as most of you did, up into the gallery space up the stairs, Millennium, Lower Manhattan in the 1990s. And this show was really occasioned by the, you can see them in this case against the back wall there, a very significant public history project which has now vanished from the streets. It was called Heritage Trails New York. Does anybody remember it from the 1990s? Anyway, started by Richard Kaplan, who was an architect and a philanthropist, and it was really his energy that he brought to the downtown situation, which in the mid-1990s was in the absolute trough of a real estate recession that had been the result of the stock market crash in 1987 and then the continuing savings and loan crisis that affected the real estate market in Lower Manhattan worse than anywhere else in New York. So it was during that decade that people like, well, after 95, Giuliani, that you see there, trained the attention of the administration and public policy in trying to solve some of these entrenched problems of Lower Manhattan, and to reinvent downtown with a new identity that thought of Wall Street and the financial district not as a now kind of exited population of financial service firms, but as a new territory for pioneer residents who would come and find the opportunity to live in formerly one of the office towers of the magnates of and kind of the titans of American business, now to be the homes for a whole new generation. But before that, and who lives downtown actually among you here? You know, and since the 1990s or before the 1990s? If you're before the 1990s, like Barbara is, you'll be one of, I have to say more, a handful of people, but between around 1,500 people in the early 90s and maybe about 3,000 and then 6,000 people by the end of the 90s. And it's almost inconceivable now when apartments on Wall Street and Broad Street and all around are, ultra luxury condominiums, and one Wall Street is being converted by Harry Macklowe to be multi-million-dollar penthouse and tower apartments. It's almost inconceivable to try to revisit that 20 years ago when nobody lived downtown. Not only were there no dry cleaners, which is the kind of classic proverbial way of thinking about, the amenities of urban life. There weren't grocery stores. But if you go back farther, if you go back into the well before the 1980s, to the origins of the Fulton Fish Market in South Street Seaport, that's exactly what they were. They were markets. They were the living, working waterfront of New York, and it was the place of commerce for the neighborhoods that were the tenements and the factory workers. And on the East River side of Lower Manhattan, as we represent through Barbara's photographs in the exhibition, and that's kind of the East River side, and this part of the exhibition is the Hudson River side, there are two different and evolving models of urbanism that simultaneously begin to change and adapt and evolve the way the downtown develops in the 1990s. So Battery Park City with all new land. How many people live in Battery Park City among them? Not interesting, none of you. And over on the west side, where artists like Barbara and also Robert Rauschenberg and John Cage and a whole slew of people who used the cold water flats of the counting houses of early 19th century New York found spaces, derelict spaces, in order to create their artwork. They were not so much pioneers, but the kind of denizens of an area of the city which represented so much of the historic core of the identity of New York. And back in, I think I read 1979,
What?
when you first moved
Yeah,
into
yeah.
Water
Late-
Street and
yeah,
downtown.
1979.
And from that time, Barbara Mensch has been living on Water Street and photographing her neighborhood and documenting the changes. And when we were doing this exhibition and thinking about how do we represent the East River side up to the year 2000, because we wanted to look at downtown before 9/11, before there was any consciousness of how, well, it couldn't be conscious, the surprise of how downtown would change cataclysmically. We were looking at the policies that were trying to push its change and reinvention by these different forces that were at work there. And when I was asking my interns and researchers about, how are we going to use photographic material in order to represent this older view of New York, Josh Vogel said to me, well, I just remembered one of my good friend's mothers is a photographer and published a book on South Street. So this is the book. And it ended up being a kind of eureka moment. It was a gold mine for the imagery and for our understanding of the Fulton Fish Market in particular, and around South Street. So from the first contact that we made by email and phone with Barbara, she was enormously generous and in every way helpful, and it was just a superb resource for the exhibition. And you see her work here, and now you're going to see it larger on the walls in her talk. So it's in that context that Barbara fits into the subject of this exhibition, both in her life and in her work. And so now I'll turn it over to her in order to give you the autobiography rather than the biography of Barbara Mensch.
Yeah.